Human Rights Watch warned that the US could face legal liability for assisting Israeli forces in Gaza, as US intelligence, planning, and arms sales have made it a party to the conflict since October 2023. Under international humanitarian law and Article 16 of the International Law Commission's draft articles on state responsibility, the US and its personnel could be held responsible for war crimes if their support significantly contributes to violations committed by Israeli forces. Despite acknowledging these abuses, both the Biden and Trump administrations continued massive military support, over $39 billion in arms sales, making the US complicit in enabling further atrocities. Amnesty's international news briefing, Nowhere to Return, Israel's extensive destruction of southern Lebanon, documents how Israeli forces deliberately devastated civilian properties and agricultural land across 24 municipalities between October 2024 and January 2025. More than 10,000 structures were destroyed or heavily damaged, much of it after a ceasefire was declared, with evidence showing soldiers using explosives and bulldozers outside combat zone. Amnesty found no imperative military necessity for much of the destruction, making it a violation of international humanitarian law and potentially a war crime. Entire communities have been rendered unhabitable, with the videos showing Israeli troops celebrating the devastation. Amnesty has called for investigations, reparations, and suspension of arms transfers to Israel, while urging Lebanon to explore domestic and international legal avenues, including possible referral to the International Criminal Court. Two men in Indonesia's Aceh province, aged 20 and 21, were publicly flogged 76 times for having consensual same-sex relations under Aceh's Islamic Criminal Code, which criminalizes such acts due to the province's special autonomy. Amnesty International condemned the punishment as an act of state-sanctioned cruelty and discrimination, stressing that corporal punishment amounts to torture under international law and that intimate relationships between consenting adults should never be criminalized. Amnesty called on the Indonesian and Acehese authorities to end these practices, repeal discriminatory bylaws, and align laws with the country's international human rights obligations, noting that Indonesia's membership in the UN Human Rights Council requires upholding equality and non-discrimination. The New Humanitarian reports that in Kakuma, Kenya, where over 850,000 refugees live under strict encampment policies, aid cuts and delays have left families surviving on as little as 20 cents a day, forcing many to eat one meal a day, go into debt, or sell assets. Oxford University's year-long study of 622 refugee households showed that reduction in food aid and in unpredictable delivery worsened hunger, collapsed local credit systems, and deepened poverty, with many refugees reporting visible hunger, insecurity, and despair. Researchers warn that scaling back aid, driven by declining donor support, particularly from the United States, is a moral failure, and call for more predictable, life-saving humanitarian funding alongside greater rights for refugees to work and move freely. Israel's new NGO registration guideline, set to be fully enforced on 9 September 2025, require international aid groups in Palestine to hand over staff details and avoid any advocacy deemed as delegitimizing Israel or risk being deregistered and blocked from delivering aid. Aid workers warn these rules will fracture the humanitarian sector, silence criticism of rights abuse, and replace impartial NGOs with organizations aligned to Israel's political and military strategy, such as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. With famine declared in parts of Gaza and violence escalating in the West Bank, humanitarians say the guidelines threaten to collapse essential services, endanger staff safety, and strips communities of food, healthcare, and education. The ICJ has condemned Tunisia's arrest and detention of judge and former presidential candidate Mourad Messaoudi, calling it arbitrary, unlawful, and in violation of his judicial immunity. Despite his ongoing legal appeals, authorities detained him in August 2025 to enforce an earlier in absentia conviction that had already been set aside, which also holding him immunicado for 2 days. The ICJ urged Tunisia to immediately release Messaoudi and political motivated prosecutions of judges and restore independent High Judicial Council while respecting judicial immunity in line with international standards. The ICJ has asked the International Court of Justice to investigate controversial remarks attributed to Vice President Justice Julia Sebutinde, in which she reportedly declared, "The Lord is counting on me to stand on the side of Israel," and framed the Gaza crisis as a biblical sign of the end times, raising serious concerns about her impartiality. The ICJ has also urged her immediate removal from the South Africa versus Israel genocide proceedings to uphold the court's integrity and align with judicial independence principles. The ICJ joined a coalition of NGOs led by Humans of Sport in Rule 9, subsection 2, submission of the Committee of Ministers on the execution of the ECTHR judgment in Semenya versus Switzerland, which found that forcing athlete Caster Semenya to undergo hormone treatment to complete violated her rights to privacy, dignity, and non-discrimination under the European Convention on Human Rights. The submission assists on the Council of Ministers in monitoring Switzerland's obligation under Article 46 ECHR, stressing the need for reforms to prevent repetition of such rights violations in sport. Given the ruling's complexity, the NGOs urge that its execution be placed under the enhanced supervision procedure supported by a wide coalition of athletes' rights and human rights organizations. Mr. Gilles Carbonnier, Vice President of the ECRC, called on states at the 11th Conference of States Parties to the Arms Trade Treaty to recommit to the treaty's humanitarian purpose by halting arms transfers where there is a clear risk of violations of international humanitarian law, stressing that political or economic interest must never override humanitarian concerns. He urged states to strengthen arms control systems, ensure effective implementation, and view disarmament and arms control as pathways to peace, warning that the unchecked flow of weapons is fueling civilian sufferings in conflict worldwide. On the 8th anniversary of the Rohingya atrocities, the OIC reaffirmed its support for the Rohingya people, calling for justice and accountability through international mechanisms, urging Myanmar to ensure their safe return, and commending Bangladesh and other states for hosting refugees, while stressing the need for continued humanitarian aid and international solidarity. The case of Oswaldo Macedo Lucero Yael versus United States before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights argues that the U.S. fostered a climate of discrimination and violence against Latinos, leading to widespread rights violation, including the 2008 murder of Lucero and the 2019 El Paso mass shooting. Petitioners contend that anti-Latino rhetoric, racial profiling, mass immigration detention, and failure to protect victims violated rights under the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Men, such as life, equality, and judicial protection. The Commission declared the case admissible in 2018, and it remains pending with further submissions from the parties. On the first anniversary of his detention, rights groups demanded the immediate release of Gao Zhen, a 69-year-old artist and U.S. permanent resident, imprisoned in China on charges of slandering heroes and martyrs for artworks critical of Mao Zedong, despite his being created before the law existed. They condemned his detention, his exit bans on his wife and child, and the use of vague laws to suppress freedom of expression and artistic freedom, calling it a violation of international human rights standards.